They say some things are easier with age, patience, acceptance, letting go, but no one ever talks about the ache of being left behind. Not just in distance, but in importance. Margaret sat by the window, the late afternoon sun casting soft lines across the hardwood floor. The house was too quiet. It had been since her husband passed. Still, she kept the kitchen clean, the porch swept, the teacups in their usual place. Some routines don't die with people, they keep going, as if time owes you something. Her son had stopped by that morning. He smiled the same way he used to when he wanted to borrow money. But this time, he came with something else, a decision already made. "We're going to the coast, Mom. Family trip. But it's probably too much for you. The walking, the stairs, the stress. We'll show you pictures after." Then, just like that, he left. No invitation. No argument. Just a quiet goodbye and the sound of tires on gravel. Margaret didn't cry. Not this time. She waited until he was gone. Then stood up slowly but firmly and walked to her dresser. From the back of the drawer, beneath an old scarf, she pulled out a thick envelope. The paper inside was crisp, unfolded, untouched. They had forgotten about this. But she hadn't. And if they thought being too old to travel meant she couldn't fight back, they were about to learn how far a woman can go when she's underestimated. It was supposed to be just a nice dinner. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a pie Margaret had baked from scratch, just like always. The house smelled like it used to, cinnamon thyme, and something a little bit sweeter. Tradition, her son David brought the wine. Her daughter-in-law Jessica brought the spreadsheets. They sat around the oak dining table, the one Margaret and her husband had sanded and stained together back in '89. It was the kind of table meant for laughter, for birthdays and school projects and Sunday morning pancakes. Now it was being used to erase. David poured wine with a polished smile. "So, Mom," he began, not meeting her eyes, "we've been thinking about the future." Margaret nodded, waiting to hear what we meant. Jessica, always too eager, unfolded a printed packet and slid it across the table. "We had a call with a financial advisor last week. Just exploring options for the vacation cabin and the farmland. You know, simplifying things. Less upkeep for you." The word you felt hollow. A placeholder. Margaret glanced at the papers but didn't touch them. "We've also looked into a senior community near the lake," David added, stabbing his chicken. "It's really beautiful, Mom. Everything you'd need. Shuttle service. Nurses on site." "No stairs," Jessica chimed in. "We just don't want you worrying about, well, anything." Margaret tilted her head. "So you're selling the cabin?" Jessica blinked. "Well, it hasn't been officially listed yet. But with Dad gone and with you slowing down," David said gently. To gently. Margaret folded her napkin in her lap. "Slowing down?" David chuckled. "It's not a bad thing. We just want what's best for you." Then came the shift, the moment so small it would have passed, unnoticed if it hadn't pierced so deep. Jessica turned to David and said, "She probably won't even notice once it's all settled. She, not you." They had already moved her into the past tense. While she was sitting right in front of them, Margaret looked at her plate. Her appetite was gone. "I can still make decisions," she said softly. Jessica gave her a smile full of pity. "Of course, Margaret. We're just helping." Helping, they spoke over her, not with her. She was background music to their plans, a sentimental footnote in their financial strategy. David shifted gears. "If we time it right, we could sell before winter. The market's good. Plus, with the insurance from Dad's policy." Jessica cut in again. "We should have power of attorney officially filed, just in case anything happens suddenly. It's really just paperwork." Margaret stiffened. Suddenly, the laughter in the room felt off. Their forks tapping porcelain sounded like gavel strikes. Every bite they took was from a meal she had made in a home she had built. While they quietly made plans to remove her from it all, she said nothing more that night. Just nodded, cleared plates, and watched them sip wine over her erasure. But something in her had changed. Later, in bed, she stared at the ceiling. She could still hear Jessica's voice. She probably won't even notice. Margaret would make sure she did, and so would they. The next morning, the house was still. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the floorboards beneath her slippers. Margaret moved slowly, not because her body was weak, but because her mind was heavy. She carried a cup of tea into her late husband's study. She hadn't touched this room much since he passed. The curtains still hung unevenly from when he'd tried to wash them and forgot to iron. His reading glasses still sat on the desk, beside a stack of crossword puzzles half finished, like everything else they never got around to. She sat down in the leather chair, let out a long breath, and looked at the old oak filing cabinet in the corner. She hadn't opened it in years. Most of it was practical bills, tax returns, appliance warranties from long-dead microwaves. But the bottom drawer stuck a little, swollen from age or maybe just resistance. When it finally gave, she saw it immediately. A faded yellow envelope, thicker than the rest. Labeled in her husband's slanted handwriting, "Private, not to be shared without my consent." She stared at it. Her fingers hesitated at first, trembling slightly, as though they knew that once this envelope was opened, things couldn't return to what they were. She opened it. Inside, neatly arranged, were documents, official ones, the original deed to the vacation property. In her name only, a copy of her husband's will, notarized, signed, sealed, and entirely different from the one her son had shown her months ago. In this version, she was listed as the sole trustee. No mention of David, no mention of shared ownership, no clause about transferring power. Margaret becomes incapable. Her name, her rights, her protection tucked between the documents was a single, handwritten note on torn stationery: "Don't let them make you small." She read it again. Don't let them make you small. Her throat tightened. He must have known, or at least suspected. Her husband wasn't perfect, but he wasn't naive either. He saw how Jessica's tone had changed, how David only called when he needed something, how they treated Margaret like she was slowly fading into the wallpaper. He knew, and he left her this. She sat back in the chair. The documents spread out before her like puzzle pieces. A quiet heat rose in her chest. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something deeper, older, a kind of buried flame she'd let flicker too long. Under the weight of politeness and patience, she picked up the will again. Read every line. Then again, her eyes sharper this time. She felt taller somehow, sitting in that chair, as if the room itself had shifted. They thought she wouldn't notice. They thought she was too old, too soft, too grateful just to be included. But she wasn't. She was prepared. She gathered the documents back into the envelope and walked over to the desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote slowly, in firm block letters, "Do not file any new documents without my approval." She signed it, dated it, and clipped it to the front of the folder. Then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Small, but real. The kind of smile you make when you realize the storm already passed and you're still standing. The call came just before lunch. Margaret had just finished sweeping the back porch when the phone rang, an unfamiliar number from the next town over. She almost didn't answer, but something in her bones told her to pick up. "Hi, this is Angela McNeil from Blue Pine Realty," the woman said brightly. "Just confirming the key drop-off for the cabin tomorrow. We're excited to start showing it to buyers this weekend." Margaret paused. "I'm sorry. What cabin?" Angela chuckled. "The Cedar View property? The one your son David listed with us last Thursday? The vacation home. Gorgeous view, by the way. We've already got 3 interested couples lined up." Margaret's stomach turned. She thanked the woman, hung up the phone, and sat at the kitchen table in silence. They had listed the cabin without even telling her. No discussion, no courtesy, nothing. The same cabin where her husband taught their granddaughter how to fish, where the family celebrated every 4th of July, where Margaret had planted lilies by the porch with her bare hands. She reached for the envelope from the study, pulled it out, reread the deed. Her name, sole owner. No transfer clause. By the time she arrived at her son's house. Her hands were shaking, but her steps were steady. David answered the door with a smile too wide. "Mom, wasn't expecting you. I'll bet." Jessica peeked from the kitchen. "Everything okay?" "No," Margaret said, stepping inside. "I just got a call from a realtor. She says you listed the cabin." David nodded, casual. "Yeah, we figured it was time." "We," she repeated. Jessica stepped forward, voice syrupy. "Margaret, it's just too much for you now. The upkeep, the stairs, the drive. It's not safe. I'm not asking you to visit it. I'm saying it's mine." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We were going to tell you. But honestly, Mom, it's just easier this way. You've got enough on your plate. Let us take care of everything, like you took care of the will," she asked, her voice cool. They froze. David chuckled nervously. "What are you talking about?" Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I'm old, David, not dead, and certainly not blind." Jessica folded her arms. "This is exactly why we didn't want to tell you. You get all worked up over nothing. Nothing." Margaret said, "The cabin is my property. I have the deed, signed original. You had no right." David raised his hands. "Look, we're just trying to make things simpler. That place is a burden now." Margaret's voice was low and steady. "It was never a burden when your father was alive, and it's not yours to sell." They looked at her like a confused child, as if she were the one not understanding. "Mom," David said softly, "we're just protecting you." That word again, protecting. Margaret nodded slowly. "Of course. Thank you for protecting me." She turned, walked back to the door, and let herself out. But inside her chest, something was burning, not from anger, but clarity. They didn't see her as a person anymore. They saw her as a problem. And problems get managed sold silenced. Margaret stood outside, the wind brushing her hair across her cheek. She looked up at the sky, squinting into the light. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She felt dangerous, not because she could yell, but because she WOULDN, single quotes, she would act quietly, precisely . And next time, it would not be them doing the protecting. That night, Margaret brewed her chamomile tea like always, stirred in a teaspoon of honey, sat in the same rocking chair her husband once sanded by hand. From the outside, everything looked normal, calm, even agreeable. She had nodded politely when David said they'd pause the cabin listing until she was emotionally ready. Jessica had smiled, satisfied with herself. They thought they'd handled her. They had no idea. Margaret watched the clock tick past 9 p.m. Then she rose from her chair and made her way down the hall, the wooden floors creaking just slightly beneath her steps. In her bedroom, she pulled down the old suitcase from the closet shelf, the one with the leather strap half torn and a faded Missoula tag still clinging to the handle. She didn't pack much. A nightgown, a change of clothes, her toothbrush. The documents went in last, sealed back inside the envelope. Tucked into the lining of her purse, she opened the bottom drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. On it, the number of a man she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Mr. Arthur Delaney. Attorney at law, he had handled her husband's estate years ago. A decent man. The kind who still wrote in cursive and believed in handshakes. She'd kept his number not because she expected to use it, but because her husband had once said, "If anything ever goes sideways, Arthur's the only one I trust." It was time. She dialed the number. A voice answered on the third ring. Older, raspier than she remembered, but still familiar. "Arthur, this is Margaret Ellison." A pause. Then warmth. "Margaret, it's been too long. I need to come in," she said. "It's about the will." He didn't ask questions. "Tomorrow? 10:30 a.m. I'll clear the schedule." She thanked him, hung up, and stood still for a moment. Not sad, not scared, just steady. She opened her jewelry box, removed the wedding ring from her finger, and placed it gently beside the pearl earrings. Not because she was letting go, but because it was time to carry something else. Now resolved at 5:15 a.m. She was already dressed and sipping coffee from the chipped mug with the mountain painted on it. She left a note on the fridge, gone for the day. Don't wait up. Mom. Then she walked down the long gravel driveway, suitcase in hand, just as the sun began to rise over the fields at the bus stop. A teenage boy nodded at her and offered his seat. She smiled and declined. Her legs were stronger than they looked. She stared out the window as the bus rumbled to life. The mountains blurred by, gold with dawn. And for the first time in weeks, her chest didn't ache. She wasn't just holding on to her past anymore. She was walking toward her future, and she was doing it alone. Not because she had to, because she chose to. The bus pulled into the station just before dawn, headlights glowing against the fogged-up windows. Margaret stood in line with a half-dozen others, a young mother with a crying infant, a man with a guitar case, a college student asleep against his backpack. No one noticed her at first. Just another older woman in a wool coat, carrying a small suitcase and a handbag clutched a little too, tightly. But inside that bag wasn't just clothing or snacks for the road. Inside was everything they tried to erase. At exactly 4:45 a.m. The Greyhound doors hissed open and she climbed aboard. The steps were steep, but she didn't waver. She chose a window seat halfway down near the emergency exit. She always liked to know how to get out just in case. The bus jolted to life, and the town began to disappear behind her. The road stretched endlessly, slicing through pine trees, truck stops, open sky. The hum of the engine was constant, lulling her thoughts into memories. She remembered holding hands with her husband on this same highway 30 years ago, when the cabin was still just a dream. He'd joked about turning it into a bed and breakfast, said they'd grow old watching the lake freeze and thaw each year like clockwork. They'd built it together, with small savings, with scraped knuckles, with love. And now David was trying to sell it off like it was some meaningless plot of land. Margaret's fingers tightened around the handle of her bag. A teenage boy with headphones bumped into her seat. He didn't apologize. She let it go. Later, an elderly woman with a kind smile offered her a piece of peppermint. Margaret accepted, whispering a thank you. Not everything in the world had gone cold. At one stop, a man in a suit stepped over her legs without looking. Another woman offered to help her with her bag at the rest station. Strangers, some kind, some indifferent. All fleeting. She didn't speak much, but she watched, listened, took it all in. She was reminded again of what it meant to feel invisible, how the world moves past you faster the older you get, how people speak louder to you like age makes you deaf, how they make decisions for you, assuming you won't notice or worse, won't fight. But Margaret wasn't deaf. She wasn't forgetful, and she wasn't done as the bus crossed into the city limits. The landscape shifted, small-town trees replaced by sharp skylines. Narrow roads widened into multi-lane stretches filled with movement, noise, and life. The courthouse was still blocks away, but she'd made it this far, at the final stop. She stepped off the bus, adjusted her coat, and lifted her suitcase. The city air was cooler, the buildings taller, but her steps didn't falter. Each block brought memories. The first apartment they rented, the diner they used to visit every anniversary, the street where he kissed her under a broken traffic light. Her legs ached, and her breathing grew heavier, but she didn't slow down. She passed a busker playing jazz on the corner, a woman pushing a stroller, a man handing out church flyers. None of them knew who she was, but she did. She was a woman walking into justice. She was a widow, a mother, a fighter, and she was about to change everything. The elevator was slow, the kind that hums and rattles like it has stories of its own. Margaret watched the numbers crawl upward. Second floor, third, fourth. She could feel the ache in her knees, but she stood tall, bag in hand, heart steady. The doors opened with a ding. The office looked exactly as she remembered. Mahogany walls, the faint scent of lemon polish, a dusty plant in the corner, still fighting for its life. A young receptionist with wide eyes looked up from her desk. "Can I help?" Before she could finish, a door swung open down the hall. "Margaret." Arthur Delaney stood in the hallway, stunned. His tie was crooked, reading glasses dangling from one hand. He looked older than she remembered, but then again, so did she. I thought you'd been... He paused, choosing his words delicately. Relocated. David said you were in assisted care. That your memory was slipping. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Well, she said calmly, turns out my memory's just fine. And so is my signature. She held out the folder. Arthur stared for a moment, then motioned her inside. They entered his office, quiet, sunlit. Lined with old law books and framed degrees, she sat down and placed the folder on the desk between. Then he opened it as he scanned each document. The deed, the trustee designation. The original will. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to a quiet fury only years in the legal field could forge. These are original, he muttered. Signed, notarized, dated. This is the final version. No question. Margaret nodded. I thought so. Arthur took off his glasses. Do you know what they've submitted? I've seen nothing, she said. Only what they've done. He shook his head slowly. They submitted a digital copy, incomplete, outdated, and unsigned. And even if it were valid, it names you as sole trustee. So what they've done, ... is illegal, he said flatly, beyond unethical. Fraudulent, if pursued in court. Margaret took a breath. It was like opening a window inside her chest. The air felt different now, lighter. Arthur looked at her deeply. Why didn't you come sooner? Because they made me feel like I couldn't, like I wasn't. Part of it anymore? He nodded, understanding more than he let on. They underestimated you. Margaret gave a small smile. They forgot I've lived more lives than they've started. Arthur chuckled, but there was admiration behind it. Well, they're about to get a reminder. He stood and walked over to a filing cabinet. Pulled out forms. Set 'em down. I can file a notice with the probate court by the end of today. We'll challenge their submission, freeze any transactions, and assert your authority as trustee. We'll get the cabin back, Margaret. And your name. She nodded. He paused. Are you ready for what this might become? It won't be quiet. I've been quiet long enough. He sat back almost reverently. Then let's begin. Margaret opened her purse, took out a pen, the one her husband had always kept on his desk. She signed the form with calm precision. It didn't matter that her hands shook slightly. The signature was solid, just like her as Arthur filed the first documents. She looked out the window at the city below, bustling, indifferent. Fast-moving, but she wasn't here to be noticed. She was here to be remembered. By the following Monday morning, the silence had turned into motion. Arthur Delaney moved swiftly, just as he promised. Legal notices were filed with the county court and the estate registrar. The real estate listing for the lake cabin vanished from every online platform by noon. A cease and desist letter was hand-delivered to the listing agent, who had the decency to look genuinely shocked at home. Margaret stood by the kitchen counter, reading the certified document in her own hands. Cease and desist, unauthorized listing of property held in trust. There it was, black and white. Legal ink on thick paper. Her name, her title, her authority. David hadn't called. Jessica hadn't texted. But Margaret knew the storm was gathering. And for once, it was gathering behind her. Later that afternoon, she sat again across from Arthur, sipping weak office coffee as he slid another form toward her. This one updates your will, he said. Revokes any existing power of attorney assigned to David. You're fully in control, Margaret. But if you want to be absolutely sure, this makes it permanent. She didn't hesitate. Picked up the pen, signed. I'm not writing anyone out of my life, she said softly. But I'm not giving them the power to write me out of my own. Arthur nodded, visibly moved. Most people don't fight back like this. Most people don't have to fight their own children, she replied. When she returned home, there were no cars in the driveway. The house was silent. She stepped inside, took off her shoes, and placed the signed documents in the safe she had moved back into her closet just as she was folding laundry that evening. Her phone vibrated. A text from Lily, Her granddaughter, I saw the listing was gone. Did you do that? Margaret replied simply, yes. There was a long pause. Then another message came through. Thank you for not staying quiet. Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed, phone in her lap. The words settled over her like a warm quilt. Not just thanks, recognition, understanding, quiet support from the next generation. She hadn't lost. Everything some roots still held strong. That night she pulled out her journal, wrote down 3 lines. I am still the trustee. The law remembers what people forget. My voice isn't gone. It was just waiting for the right time. She closed the book, turned off the light, and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders, the silent, suffocating grief, had begun to lift. Not because the fight was over, but because she had remembered who she was, not a burden. Not a background character, she was the author and the title of her next chapter, Restoration. It began with the sound of gravel. Margaret stood by the window, hands folded, watching her son's SUV roll up the long Montana driveway. Behind it, Jessica's silver sedan pulled in sharply, almost impatiently. No phone call, no text, no warning. But she knew this visit was inevitable. She poured herself tea and sat at the kitchen table, calm as snowfall. The front door swung open before she could reach it. Mom? David's voice carried a strange mixture of confusion and confrontation. What's going on? Jessica followed, eyes sharp. We got a call from the real estate agent. The cabin sale's been frozen. What did you do? Margaret didn't stand. She looked at them evenly and gestured to the empty chairs across from her. Sit. Jessica remained standing. David reluctantly took a seat, his brow furrowed. I asked you a question, Jessica said, and I'll answer, Margaret said, sliding the folder across the table, but only once. Jessica opened it. David leaned in. There, stacked neatly, the notarized deed, the trust documents, the original will, and the legal notice revoking power of attorney, all bearing Margaret's name, all legally binding. David read in silence. Jessica skimmed with growing agitation. When she reached the last page, her face flushed red. This is manipulative. You've been planning this? Jessica snapped. No, Margaret said evenly. I've been remembering who I am. David's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. You went behind our backs. She tilted her head. You walked past my front. Double quotes. Silence. Jessica scoffed, arms crossed. You're making a big mistake, Margaret. You're tearing this family apart over paperwork. No, she replied softly. You did that when you treated me like paperwork. Something to be filed, forgotten, rewritten. David stood up slowly. You could have just talked to us. I tried, she said. But talking to walls doesn't work. I needed to speak to something that could hear me. The law. Jessica stormed out without another word, slamming the door behind her. David lingered, still standing, looking older than his years. So, what now? Margaret stood too, not with aggression, but with quiet certainty. I'm not here to ask for your permission, she said. I'm here to remind you of mine. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and walked out, leaving the door gently ajar. The wind carried in the soft scent of pine. Margaret closed the folder, tucked it away, and placed a small, rose-shaped ceramic bowl in the center of the table, the same one she and her husband used to keep spare keys in. This time, it held something different, her own set of boundaries. The sky was pink and pale, brushed with orange like the soft bloom of a peach. Margaret sat on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in her husband's old flannel jacket. The early morning air kissed her cheeks. She could smell the lake, cool still and honest. The birds were beginning their songs, not loud, just persistent. Like life itself, she had brought only 3 things with her this time: a leather journal, a pen that felt right in her fingers, and the documents she'd rewritten in her own hand. The house was hers. The view, the pine trees, the creaky porch swing, hers. But more than that, her choices were hers again. She opened the journal not to write to her son or her daughter-in-law, not even to Lily, though she loved the girl dearly. This letter was to someone else. To the woman who was told to shrink, she began. To the mother whose value was measured in what she gave away. To the wife who forgot her own name while carrying her husband's legacy. To the grandmother sitting in a chair someone else put her in. I see you. I was you. I am you. She paused, tears warming the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the relief of finally being able to say it all. They told me I couldn't travel, that I wasn't strong enough. But I didn't need distance. I needed direction. She thought about the trip to the lawyer's office, the long ride, the silence. The way strangers looked at her, the way her own family had looked through her dot, and then she remembered the receptionist's face when she walked into Arthur's office. She remembered taking off her coat and saying, with all the weight of her years, I have something you'll want to see. That moment, quiet and small on the outside, was everything. It was revolution disguised as routine. Back in the cabin, the fireplace had long gone out. She hadn't needed heat that night. Truth! She picked up the new will she had written, no lawyers this time. No typed documents, no digital files, just her handwriting. Her words, her boundaries etched in black ink. She signed it with her full name, Margaret June Whitmore, witness to her own strength, keeper of her own story. Then she added a final line. Next time they call me too old. I hope they remember how far I walked to write this myself. She closed the journal and set it gently on the table beside her. The wind stirred, lifting the edges of the pages like fingers asking to read. Margaret leaned back in the rocking chair. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe more silence from David. Maybe another apology from Lily. Maybe just another morning, just like this one. But she knew this. She wasn't waiting for anyone to hand her back her life. She had taken it. She had folded grief into resilience. She had turned betrayal into blueprint. She had written a new beginning with the same hand that once wiped her son's tears, held her husband's hand, and made dinner without thanks for years. Now that same hand had drawn a line, not one that kept others out, but one that kept her in. The sun lifted over the lake, slow and warm. Margaret stood. Her bones ached, but they held. She took one step forward, then another, and in that quiet movement, in that slow walk down the porch stairs, was something sacred. Not revenge, not retribution, but return.